Hey, Pastor Steve Waldron. I hope you're having an incredible day or night in Jesus. This is Divine Christology by Brant, Pitre, and we'll talk a little bit about it in a moment. Thanks for being here. So Brant, Pitre, and I think it's Pitre, maybe Pitre, I'm not sure how to pronounce that, but Jesus and Divine Christology. Jesus and Divine Christology by Erdman's Publishing. So again, thanks for being here. Join us daily. Check out our other videos. Subscribe, hit the bell notification, put it on social media. What this book does, rather conclusively in my opinion, is it shows repeatedly that Jesus considered himself as divine. Now, we're going to read some about it, dig into it, but here's kind of the broad spectrum what this does. Most, as he points out, of mainstream scholarship says Jesus just walked around as a prophet, and nobody can really figure out why his disciples a few years later began considering him as divine. Well, what he points out is all through the Gospels, even some places a lot of people miss, that Jesus is claiming to be God. And so the reason his disciples called him God is they were followers of Jesus. And so when you followed Jesus, you followed his teaching. And since Jesus claimed to be God, then they said, well, we'll just follow Jesus. He's God. Even after his death, burial, and resurrection, they just continued this on in the book of Acts, in the epistles, on and so forth. And this is known as early high Christology. And so let's look at a little bit of the things. First of all, Dale Allison, the great NASCAR driver, that is a joke. But Dale C. Allison, Jr., professor of New Testament at Princeton Theological, has this to say about it. Too many attempts to explain the advent of early high Christology pay insufficient attention to the historical Jesus. This, as Pitre, and forgive me if I'm saying his name wrong, rightly recognizes as a huge blunder, the error not only leaves much about early Christianity unexplained, but overlooks much in the synoptics that could count as history. Even if one disagrees with some of his answers, Pitre's asking the right questions and pushing the guild in the right direction. And then Matthew Levering, James N. Jr., and Mary D. Perry, Chair of Theology, Mundelein Seminary, Brant Pitre has established himself as a preeminent Catholic historical Jesus scholar alive today, kind of like Carl Rayner was in the 1960s. A lot of the same conclusions, actually, and indeed is one of the most important Christian thinkers of the 21st century. This present book engages perhaps the biggest question he has taken on yet. Did Jesus think of himself not only as human, but also as divine? Immensely readable and erudite. I would agree with that. Very readable. This persuasive and brilliant book will be a touchstone for all future studies of this controversial topic. And then it's also recommended by Matthew W. Bates, author of The Birth of the Trinity, Jesus, God, and Spirit, New Testament, Early Christian Interpretation of the Old Testament, professor of New Testament, Northern Seminary, says, finally, by showing from history that Jesus made divine claims about himself, Brant Pitre has compelled the prodigal quest for the historical Jesus to return home. This book should be received with open arms because it's most necessary and convincing. And I've made myself notes here. That's kind of where I make my notes. So many people have so much better note systems than I do. This is a 224 book printed by in the United States of America. This picture, by the way, is a 6th century, 500s AD picture of Jesus. I thought that was interesting. So Philo of Alexandria says God could sooner change into a human than a human into God. And that's interesting. And I'm not a big Philo of Alexandria fan at all. So the quest in Jesus' divinity, this goes back to the quest for historical Jesus, Albert Schweitzer, and all this. And he makes a great thing. I'll just reemphasize this, that most modern scholarship's asking all the wrong questions. They're making a presuppositional assumption that Jesus never claimed to be God. He just goes to the historical facts using the Gospels as historical narrative, which has been shown over and over and over again since at least Simon Greenleaf, Testimony of Four Evangelists in the 1860s, but well before that, really, the Mathers and all of that. And shows that Jesus constantly claimed to be God. So, and that's the famous C.S. Lewis conundrum that good people don't claim to be God, Jesus claimed to be God. So either Jesus is a liar or he's a lunatic or he's Lord. Because only liars or lunatics claim to be God unless he actually is God. So he's got the quest in Jesus' divinity, the historical Jesus, early high Christology, for historical warrants, method of proceeding. Now, I did want to say about early high Christology, like Hurtado has said by 50 AD that the early church was binitarian, and it just goes from there, whether it's Craig Evans, Richard Bauckham, on and on. The Epiphany miracles, the miracles of Jesus, stilling the storm, walking the sea, the transfiguration, the riddles of Jesus' divinity, the teacher of parables greater than father or mother, which that was a good point. I'm not sure I had ever just seen that point. No one is good but God. I'd seen John R.W. Stott make that. The riddle of David's Lord, the apocalyptic secret, the apocalyptic Jesus, the heavenly Son of Man, the question of John the Baptist, the apocalyptic thunderbolt, crucified for blasphemy. I thought this was a good section. The criterion of execution, they picked up stones, John 10, John 8. You make yourself God, the charge of blasphemy. And implications, ex nihilo nihil fit. What is that? That's something comes out of nothing, or nothing comes out of nothing, I think, or something like that. Early divine Christology, departing of ways, the long road to Nicaea, acknowledgments. Always one of my favorite parts of bibliography, index of authors, index of subjects, index of scripture and other ancient sources. And I haven't looked at the bibliography to any large degree anyhow yet. So turning to page 268, I just wanted to share just a few things out of this. So consequences, Christological monotheism, and the stonings of Jewish Christians. This harkens back to me to David Reed's designation of oneness Pentecostals in the United Pentecostal Church. But he means something a little different in it here. So finally, if Jesus did indeed claim to have existed before Abraham, and if he used the divine I am to identify himself, then this would provide a reasonable explanation for two notable features of practiced belief in the early church. So, I mean, that's just obvious. And I will say he takes Bart Ehrman to task extraordinarily well. He keeps going along this line. Although these passages do not contain the absolute form of I am, ego eimi, such as John 8:58, the repeated frame of I am, ego eimi, does identify the risen Christ with the pre-existent eternal God. How is this possible? One reasonable historical explanation is that during his lifetime, Jesus laid the foundations of later divine Christology when he claimed to have existed before Abraham and identified himself using the divine I am. Moreover, if Jesus was indeed almost stoned to death for blasphemy during his public ministry in Jerusalem, this would provide a plausible explanation for the evidence of some early Jewish believers in Jesus were executed by stoning at the behest of the Jerusalem Sanhedrin, which I thought that was an interesting point as well, bringing the Jewish evidence of stoning Christian believers. And that comes from Larry Hurtado's pre-70 CE Jewish opposition to Christ devotion and his ancient Jewish monotheism and early Christian Jesus devotion, the context and character of Christological faith, put out by Baylor in 217. And then he's also got a Hamill book, Jewish Activity Against Christians in Palestine According to Acts, Palestinian Setting, Volume 4, the Book of Acts, First Century Setting, Richard Bauckham, 1995. So those are all excellent, excellent points. Why would Jews be stoning Christians? And he makes a big point, really the only reason they would be stoning at that time would be in a large degree for claiming divinity, even though we know we have the John 8 episode of the woman taken in adultery as well. So let's keep going here. Some other things. He has an extremely good point that the exchange between Jesus and the Sanhedrin, that people try to say, well, we don't really have any eyewitness historical account of that. That's just really given by inspiration. But he shows how wrong that is. That, first of all, John kind of followed Jesus in there. Of course, Peter was nearby. And then he brings out the point, too, are we to say that none of the Sanhedrin, including some, as we see in the book of Acts, there was a huge revival amongst the Jewish community in Jerusalem going into Acts 20, Acts 21, but previous to that as well, that none of them ever spoke about things, that none of the guards ever spoke about things, whether converted or not. So he really just makes excellent point here. And then it's got one of the greatest divinity of Jesus charts you'll ever see on page 328. And it basically goes through things that Jesus did and said that are equated with Jehovah in the Old Testament. So he says, look, I've only examined 12 out of 365 pericopes or snippets of the life of Jesus. And he said, so there's more, but this is just 12 of them. Rather, he spake and acted as if he were co-equal with the one God of early Jewish monotheism, appeared to Moses on Mount Sinai. If this overall hypothesis is correct, then it would go without saying that the now long-standing tradition of asserting there's no evidence whatever that Jesus spoke or acted like he believed himself to be a god or divine needs to be left behind as the outdated relic that it is. And just so many other things as well. He says, last but certainly not least, the hypothesis, this is page 330, that Jesus spoke and acted as if he were divine during his lifetime, also has enormous implications for development of Christological belief in the early church. As the words of E.P. Sanders quoted at the beginning of this chapter testify, when it comes to the aftermath of Jesus' life, contemporary scholarship has had a difficult time doing justice to Klausner's historical principle of nothing comes from nothing. So nothing comes from nothing. So how did belief Jesus became God in their minds? Nothing comes from God because Jesus told them he was God. So, and it goes into the monotheistic features of later Christological doctrine. And just a couple other points that people I've sent this to, professors, PhDs, this type of thing. The first implication of our study impacts the current debate over the origins of early high Christology. If the historical Jesus claimed to be the divine Messiah and was rejected and condemned to death as a result, then this would provide a compelling explanation for the earliest Christology was high Christology. That is Christology in which Jesus, a divine being, he becomes human. In other words, the smoke of early divine Christology originated in the fire of Jesus' own divine messianism. And he even quotes Bart Ehrman there. And so the bibliography, like I said, I really hadn't looked through this, but this is where you're going to find, I already see this, oh yeah, R.P.C. Hansen, The Search for the Christian Doctrine of God, the Arian Controversy, that's so important right there. Adolf Harnack's What is Christianity? Louis Hartman, The Book of Daniel. Oh man, just great stuff. One last thing on the back cover, Chris Tilley, who's got some amazing stuff on the divinity of Jesus himself. He's the head of research and senior lecturer in New Testament studies at St. Mellitus College. You hold in your hands a scholarly majority buster, and a deeply learned and persuasive one at that. the early Christ followers seemed to understand that Jesus to be fully divine. So, I mean, that's incredible. He says it's a buster of those kind of things. Where did I see where, oh, there it is. Brant, Pitre's distinguished research professor of scripture at the Augustine Institute Graduate School of Theology, and he's authored numerous books, including Jesus and the Last Supper, and Paul, a New Covenant Jew, Rethinking Pauline Theology. Yeah, and that's where this is Christ, Pantocrator, 6th century, like ruler, 6th century St. Catherine's Monastery, Mount Sinai. So 500. So, incredible book. God bless. I can't say I agree with everything in there, but a lot in there. God bless. Talk with you later. Jesus is God. Bye-bye.